Good afternoon, everyone. I hope that you all have been enjoying the conference thus far. I know that I have. Good afternoon. My name is Felicia Henry, and I get the privilege and the honor to be a part of this session today, where we are going to hear phenomenal poetry from Denice Frohman. And then we're going to have like a fireside chat, a little conversation following those performances. So I'm going to introduce her now, and then please be ready for what is going to be just straight fire. So, Denice Frohman is a poet, a performer, and an educator from New York City. A Threshold Fellow at Headlands for the Arts, she's received support from CantoMundo, the National Association of Latino Arts and Cultures, Leeway Foundation, Blue Mountain Center, and Millay Colony. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, the BreakBeat Poets, LatiNext, an anthology for queer poets of color, and elsewhere. A former Women of the World's Poetry Slam champion, she's featured on national and international stages from the Apollo to the White House. She lives in Philadelphia. So I know that we are all not seeing you, but please give a clap for her. And Denice, please take it away. I am so excited to hear you and then to have a conversation after.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Felicia. Thank you to everyone at the MILLSUMMIT, at Spur Impact, for organizing this gathering. I am coming to you live from Philadelphia, not too far from where you all will be gathering in person, I believe tomorrow. And so I'm going to be sharing some poems with you all, but I want to share some sort of brief remarks on what it means to be an artist, creating work during such a wild time of many social unrest and necessary reckonings that are happening while we're navigating so many various disasters and pandemics and crises. For me, poetry has always been a harbor. It has been a space of multiplicity, a vehicle that can hold more than one thing at one time. And ultimately, I always say this to audiences, whether or not some of us identify as artists or don't, to me is really not the question, because I see poetry as a practice. It is a way to rehearse. It is a way to exercise this muscle of empathy, and this muscle of connection. I see poetry ultimately as an invitation to build an intentional relationship with language. And I hope Felicia and I will get a chance to chat more about what I mean by that after the performance. But we have seen how language can be used for justifying inhumane laws and policies and behavior, but it can also be a space where we connect and where we build community and love and healing. And that's the space that I'm interested in. For those of you who are in the room, and I'm sure this is a room full of young professionals from various industries, sometimes I ask myself, well, what is a writer doing here? And for a long time, I didn't see myself as a writer, even though I was performing and publishing poetry for many years. I grew up, I didn't know any writers, and I had a really narrow perception of who a writer was. And really what I mean by that is whose stories were worth telling, whose truths were worth centering. And I certainly didn't feel entitled to take up that space. I didn't think that my story was important or valuable. And poetry and spoken word more largely became a space for me to, was a harbor for myself to build a deeper understanding of my own identity, but also to build a political consciousness, right? Because poems are, again, acts of recognition, which I see as acts of care, right? It is slowing down time enough to say, I see you, to say that the language that we use should be language of love and reclamation. And so for me, as a young person, as a young professional, I never thought that I would be a writer full-time at all. And yet this is sort of the path that life has taken me on. And I'm happy to talk more about what that journey has looked like, as a women artist, as a Latina artist, as a queer artist, and writer, working with various communities. But I think you all are here to hear poems. And so I want to start by sharing a poem that was inspired by one of the first Latina lesbian authors that I had ever read, Gloria Anzaldúa. Her name might be familiar to some of you in the room or maybe new to some of you in the room, but she edited one of the seminal feminist anthologies called This Bridge Called My Back in the early 1980s. And Anzaldúa, who was a scholar and a poet herself, asked a really important question in this anthology. She was writing an open letter to other women of color writers, writing at a time when the publishing industry was not interested in publishing their stories or hearing their voices. And Anzaldúa asked her fellow women of color writers a simple question, but a profound one. Who gave us permission to perform the act of writing? Who gave us permission? I rest on that word permission because I think it's a radical question, again, for those of us who have not felt like our stories have mattered, who have been conditioned by society to make ourselves smaller. And so this poem is called A Woman's Place, and it is exploring and meditating on this question of permission, but also this question of what happens when a woman uses her voice and refuses to be small. I heard a woman becomes herself the first time she speaks without permission. Then every word out her mouth a riot. Say beautiful and point to the map of your body. Say brave and wear your skin like a gown or a suit. Say hero and cast yourself in the lead role. When a girl pronounces her own name, there is glory. When a woman tells her own story, she lives forever. All the women I know are perennials, marigolds, daffodils, soft things that refuse to die. I don't come from anything tamed or willing. I come from soil floss with barbed wire, meaning abuela would cuss you out with the same breath she kissed you with. Her blood, a wild river. My mother doesn't rely on instruction manuals or men, nor does she equate the two. Can fix anything if you get out of her way, says the best technology, her own two hands. But once I dreamed I had no teeth, just a mouth to hold other people's things. If this poem is the only thing that survives me, tell them I grew a new tongue. Tell them I built me a throne. Tell them when we discovered life on another planet, it was a woman, and she built a bridge, not a border, got God, and named gravity after herself. Thank you. I wish we could all be physically in the same room right now, but I am feeling your energies, and please feel free to use the chat as I'm also following along. For the women professionals in the room, I wanted to start off by sharing, and anyone who has felt marginalized or comes from a marginalized experience, which our experiences are the center. So I want to reframe that. But I have been in so many rooms where I have felt like I have been asked to negotiate myself into a smaller space. And it has taken years and years. It is a practice to work against those forces and impulses. And so I want to encourage, if you are a young person starting your career, or especially if you are a young woman in an industry that is male dominant by design, I hope that you hold this poem and other words of inspiration to know that you get to be big, you get to take up space, and you get to show up as yourself. Before I was a poet, I played basketball on an athletic scholarship in college. And I played it semi-professionally in Puerto Rico after college. So basketball was my whole life. And my introduction almost to my gender was an introduction to being othered. Not only because of all the experiences that come with being a young girl living in a city, living in America, but also because the basketball court was not only a site of me coming into my own body, but it was a site of also negotiating the narrow gender expectations that boys had, right? And that we have as a society around sports and around girls playing sports and girls playing basketball. It's something that I'm very, very passionate about. And I'll talk a little bit in a second about how I think those two worlds blend, or maybe Felicia and I can talk about how sports and arts have blended in my life. But I want to share this poem, which is part of a larger series of basketball sonnets. And I see basketball and poetry as having a symbiotic relationship in my life. Both are about establishing an expectation and then undoing that expectation, right? What is an Allen Iverson crossover but creating an expectation and then undoing it and switching directions? And that is, to me, is what makes a poem sing. So this poem I want to dedicate again to all of those who have felt othered or marginalized in their industry and really underestimated in their industry, and who come to work every day proving people wrong. This poem is called Lady Jordan. It didn't matter that I married the game or slept with a ball under my arm. Mom said, girls don't hoop, they wear hoops. And around here, vecinas chirped, it's always y tu novio season. But isn't beauty a finger roll, a backdoor cut on the blacktop, a fadeaway jump shot, 2 seconds left on the clock? So what mattered was Danny talking smack, even though his teeth were out of order. This isn't the only history, but it is the history of everything. The neighborhood boys who shot crooked never learned my name. So I played them 21, turned their ankles to jello, made their backs kiss the floor until they donned me Lady Jordan. And who wouldn't take that? Though I've never been ladylike, I wore that rusted metal rim like a ring and slipped my bones through the net like a perfect white dress. Thank you. I would love for you to, yes, shout out your industries in the comments. I would love to know. I love hearing more about the industries that you are navigating because of your gender and how, that has played a role in your experience. A good friend of mine, Fabiana Rodriguez, she's a visual artist, an activist, and an organizer out in the Bay. She works a lot with environmental justice. She talks about the relationship between storytelling and social justice. And I want to share her words with you. She talks about the power of culture to shift, right? And to move the conversation forward. Because politics and laws are typically the slowest things to change, right? They are the gears, the machinations that take the longest to turn. And oftentimes it's culture and through storytelling that those gears end up turning, right? It is the stories that we tell, the narratives that we subscribe to, the narratives that we counter, the narratives we create that change and influence the attitudes and beliefs that are in our workplaces, that are in our schools, that are in our homes and in our societies. And so poetry and art, to me, have a big role in that because they're about re-engaging and rethinking our relationship with one another. I always say that poetry, in poetry and as a writer, it's a space where I don't have to make sense to make meaning. I don't have to be legible to be discoverable. And I find so much liberation in that space because poems are not about answers, right? And in our workspaces, if there's not always a clear answer, or when we're deciding whether to take this job or that job. But it is about really holding space for that multiplicity, the multiplicity of truths in our offices, in our workspaces, in our industry, and in our lives. And I find that poetry shares a really important role, again, in practicing, right, in getting used to multiple truths, and also building an intentional relationship with language. And so this poem that I'm going to share with you is called Petition. I wrote it in thinking about the role of music and art in social justice. And you might recognize some Philly landmarks in this poem. Petition. Petition. To pledge allegiance to the DJ's brushstroke, the jazz singer's sacred scat, the conguero's poetry. Petition to honor the holy of a two-step. When the day feels like a procession of sorrow, petition to replace this stench of awful with trombones and xylophones, with pleneros and pop locks, with dreams projected on rooftops from 52nd to 5th and Lehigh. Petition to rename all our streets with the faces of our beloved bards. Hello, Sonia Sanchez Way. Hello, Ursula Rucker Avenue. May we stand at the intersection of love and rage, singing something big is coming. And while we're here, petition. And while we're here, petition for drumming to be an Olympic sport, for salsa to be an official language, for the national anthem to be rewritten by young people chanting El Pueblo Unido down Market Street. Petition to elect the juicy June berries outside my window, the cherry blossoms shedding their pink skins. Petition to swoon over the canopy of sunflowers on Osage, their bulbed skins protruding like speakers. Or just a block away, a blues of lamb's ear grows its velvety skin so soft when they say, there's no beauty here. Whisper, here is my flag. Petition to be remade and unmade in the making, the way a monarch butterfly slithers from its wetsuit just before diving headfirst into the world. Petition because the time is now to grow new limbs, to say what needs to be said, do what needs to be done. Petition to replace canisters of smoke with the smoke lyricists leave in their trails, with the singing of we the people, if and only if we means smoke signal, a billowing cloud of hands that says your liberation is my liberation and my liberation is your liberation. So petition to pick up the brooms, the bass, petition to heed the call of this day, to hum that tune as we use our tools, as we dance, as we paint, as we sing, as we do language, as we reimagine, we reckon, as we rewire, we remember, as we join the booming orchestra of movement singing, something big is coming. Something big is already here. Thank you. Thank you for sharing in the comments. I see people coming from who are self-employed entrepreneurs and freelancers who are in the travel industry. So please continue having that conversation. I'm watching close by. This poem this next poem is about labor, about work, about workers and who we deem as valuable workers, and how we see which kinds of work are important. And for me, growing up in New York City, growing up the daughter of a musician, and having family members who were farmers, who were domestic workers, I was always really in tuned to how it's the essential workers, right, who are the backbone of the workplace in so many ways, and of this country in so many ways. And it is also the most essential workers who are at most risk, and also, to me, are least protected. Growing up in New York City, I grew up around a bunch of street vendors who were the centerpieces of our communities, who were familiar to us. They were part of the fabric of our community. And I also grew up, saw them being criminalized and displaced due to gentrification. And so this poem is an homage and is in celebration of not just street vendors who I grew up around, but also day laborers and domestic workers and nurses and teachers and the people who pick our fruits and vegetables, and all of the people who made this conference happen as well, including tomorrow the people that will be setting up the chairs and those who are creating this technology platform, right? It's all of the people who are the backbone of and allow us to show up, right, in these spaces. And so I want to take a moment to honor them, to acknowledge them. And, you know, a good one life lesson that I always go by is always thank your server. So this is a poem for the servers and for the street vendors and for the people in my family, and maybe you or somebody you know and love. This poem is called A Queer Girl's Ode to the Piragüero. A piragua is sort of a shaved ice, what Americans, I guess, call snow cones. But many cultures have different variations of this treat. In New York City and in Puerto Rican just culture, we call it a piragua, and the person serving it a piragüero. Oh, piragüero, my first lover, the only man I ever wanted anything from. I sprinted half blocks for you, got off the bus 2 stops early, took the long way home just to see your rainbow umbrella. Oh, piragüero, candy cool syrup god. Boricua, Batmobile, wooden cart pushing, bobsled, papi. When the viejitas ask for the 10th time whether I got un novio, a boyfriend, the closest name on my tongue was you. Who else made me break my neck in two? Who else gave me so much for $1? Who raised hell when they nicknamed your delicacy snow cone, or worse, shaved ice? I trusted you, the hallelujah work of your bare hands, the dirty white kitchen towel you laid over a fat block of ice. And never once did I ask questions. And when they pushed you off 9th Ave, when you packed up on 96, I only saw you after ball games on 131st and 5th, when the hipsters threw ice in paper cups, added nutmeg and real ingredients like mint leaves, called this an upscale makeover for a poor man's treat. I wanted to shout out, no, leave my man alone. Tell me, who else could turn a blue shopping cart into a 57 Chevy or a mom and pop shop? Maybe the elotero on El Centro, the churro ladies by the A train. Maybe my mama, once a nanny, who sewed curtains for a couple upstairs, made an office out of her hands. Or my pops, who cut his saxophone into the velvet flesh of night, rearranged the altitude of a palladium dance floor. And then a plump wad of cash, a worn rubber band, a 401k shoebox, which is to say, praise everything we build under the table, the underworld of workers, wielders, America's thumping bassline, the chorus of a country where 2 for 1 is the best hook to every good song I know. Like the way you turned my tongue into a red carpet, like the first woman I ever loved. Oh, piragüero, you winter my whole mouth, you conductor of cool. You're the only one I know, the only one who can govern the thick heat like a DJ scratching a glacier. You make the whole city rock. Thank you. I see some folks, some Boricuas in the chat. Wepa. But I really want to celebrate the collective ingenuity of immigrants and of everyday workers and of the brilliance that oftentimes gets overlooked. And so I share that in that spirit. I have two more poems to share, and then me and Felicia, I'm really excited to have this fireside chat with Felicia. This next poem was written after Hurricane Maria. We are coming up on the 5-year anniversary since Maria devastated the island and really revealed in greater clarity for those of us stateside and for the world the second-class citizenship that Puerto Ricans experience on the island. The humanitarian crisis, the political and economic crisis, and the forces that have really made recovery incredibly difficult. And by forces, I mean the colonial relationship between the United States and Puerto Rico being what many consider the oldest colony. And we don't really learn this stuff in school. We don't learn about this relationship. And I think what Maria revealed was the unevenness of the relationship was not Puerto Rico as some sort of charity case that takes and takes from the United States, but actually that the United States acts as some parental figure, right, which is very paternalistic, this colonial figure that is neglectful and that continues to extract and exploit resources from everyday Puerto Ricans. And there's just huge fights all over the island since 98% of the island Congress and the government designated as opportunity zones and really laid out in US policy the red carpet for investors to literally buy large chunks of land. And what does that mean for Puerto Ricans on the island? What does it mean? This poem is called Puertopia. It was borrows its name from a New York Times article that documented investors coming to Puerto Rico because they saw an opportunity to make a dollar when there is devastation, right? These are investors who want to create their own cities, who are creating elaborate resorts and luxuries on the island, and not with no real benefit to the people who are there, to Puerto Ricans. They're not creating jobs. There's been no real study that has said this has been a benefit or economic boost for those on the island. And I know I'm taking a few minutes longer to share this, but this is incredibly important to share because so much of US businesses and investments are knowingly and unknowingly tied to either Puerto Rican debt, which many consider to be an illegal debt, or to quote unquote economic projects that are really about exploitation and privatizing public resources and public lands and the beaches. This poem is called Puertopia, dedicated to all the Puerto Ricans, both here in the diaspora and on the island, who are saying Puerto Rico no se vende, which is Puerto Rico is not for sale. Puertopia. The coquis don't sing anymore. They click. Mosquitoes turn drone. Metropolis of crypto bro. Tax deductible greed. A door opens. An island drowns. A playground emerges. A boy. His toy. Depending on the faith, the most dangerous part of a wealthy man, his index finger. What he points to. Who he lands on. A civilization, disposable income. Pirate in cargo short. New world. Old order. Meanwhile, we, diaspora, separated by sea, peel plátanos and cut them on the same angle our mothers taught us to clap when the plane lands on either shore. Now, the beaches are gated and no one knows the names of the dead. Now, investors clean their beaks in the river, and this is how a man becomes a flood. Landlord of nothing, king of no good sky. Watch paradise misbehave. Watch the night pearl into a necklace of fists. Watch this El Junque, a real God machine, unhinge her jaw and swallow the flock. Where are the Puerto Ricans, huh? Cuchifrito ghost town, battery operated citizenship. An island is not a tarmac. A disaster is not a destination. Thank you. I have one last poem to share with you all. And I just again want to thank all of you for being present and for being here today. And I just again cannot wait for tomorrow's presentation, which I hear is going to be also incredible. But also again, thank you for being here during the session. And this last poem I want to dedicate to anybody whose first language is not English. This poem I wrote for my mom, whose first language is Spanish. And I wanted to share the words of one of my favorite poets, Douglas Kearney, who said, if broken English breaks English, then let it be broke. This poem is called Accents. My mom holds her accent like a shotgun with two good hands. Her tongue all brass knuckles slipping in between her lips. Her hips are all laughter and wind clap. She speaks a sancocho of Spanish and English, pushing up and against one another in rapid fire. Mira, there is no telling my mama to be quiet. My mama don't know quiet. Her voice is one size better fit all, and you best not tell her to hush. She waited too many years for her voice to arrive to be told it needed housekeeping. See, English sits in her mouth remixed, so strawberry becomes a strawberry, and cookie becomes a cookie, and kitchen, keychain, and chicken all sound the same. My mama doesn't say yes, she says aha, and suddenly the sky in her mouth becomes a Hector Lavoe song. Her tongue can't lay itself down flat enough for the English language. It got too much hip, too much bone, too much conga, too much cuatro to two-step. Got too many piano keys in between her teeth. It got too much clave, too much hand clap, got too much salsa to sit still. It be an anxious child wanting to make Play-Doh at a concrete. English be too neat for her kind of wonderful. Her words spill in conversation between women whose hands are all they got. Sometimes our hands are all we got, and accents that remind us that we are still bomba, still plena. You say huepa, and a stranger becomes your hermano. You say dale, and a crowd becomes a family reunion. My mother's tongue is a telegram from her mother, decorated with the coquis of El Campo. So even when her lips can barely stretch themselves around English, her accent is a stubborn compass, always pointing her towards home. Thank you so much. Thank you. And now I think me and Felicia get to chat. Felicia, I think you're still on mute. So I want
to. Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. I just really hope that folks will go into the chat. Please, like, give your hand claps, all your emojis, all of the things. Denice, that was phenomenal. Like, phenomenal. And I'm so appreciative of sharing this space with you right now. Especially that last poem. My parents are both from Jamaica, and so even that really just stuck with me, because I'm like, yeah, some of these words, it's just like, whatever, but it really just brings and like really highlights the beautiful nature of what it means to belong, what it means to be home, what it means to have culture and be able to share in that, right? And not feel like something is wrong, not feel like they haven't quite grasped it, but to really acknowledge and appreciate like what makes them unique and different and special, and how that really ties us all together. So I mean, literally, I am blown away. I'm blown. I know I have lots to say, and I know that I have lots of questions to ask, but I enjoyed every single one of your poems, and so thank you again for for being here and gracing the stage. And for the audience members, even though we can't see you, please jump in the chat and show your appreciation and your applause. The first thing that I want to do is kind of go back to the beginning when you first started, before you actually got into your poems. And you were talking about how you see poetry, as a tool to build language and as a practice. And so I just want to go back to that and ask specifically about how you knew poetry would be that artistic medium for you and your journey into kind of writing and performance.
That's a great question. I mean, I think the truth is I didn't know. And in fact, I actually didn't like poetry at all. You know, a lot of us in school were exposed to a really narrow canon, right? A very Eurocentric, right? Like, to be frank, the poetry a lot of us are taught in school is we leave with this misconception that it's only basically a form for like dead white men, right? Or like older white men. Like we are not exposed. And so I think the reason it took me so long to see poetry as a space for my own self-expression and artistic creation was less about what brought me to it and more about what kept me from it. And I think once that canon, right, started to expand, which is really to say I started to see a truer representation of literature and of the long Nuyorican poetry movement, right, and other women of color writers and James Baldwin. I mean, I was just getting to college and I was salivating, and I think the question, I hear the question differently now around what brought me to poetry in a number of ways, including I think about what were the first seeds of language for me, what were the first seeds of song and of songwriting, and what shaped my fascination with language and with rhythm and musicality, which are I employ and many poets employ in their work. But why is my ear always attuned, right, to a particular rhythm that I feel I can sing in my work, and it gets me excited. And I think, you know, it was basketball that taught me how to be a poet. It is it is a performance art, right? And I see performance as an internal rhythm externalized, right? Not another body, but an extension of the body. And so that internal rhythm was fed at a really early age on the basketball court. I grew up playing street ball primarily. My college coaches, they hated it. They were like, we want you to play the right way, and you don't have to do all these fancy dribbling. But you know, New York City New York City is the mecca of street ball. And that was how I learned to play basketball. And so that had a really big influence on my relationship with language, with talking smack, with being quick to, you know, defend yourself or to be creative with language. And also my dad played saxophone for Tito Puente for 25 years. So I was always with him at his concerts and at his rehearsals at a young age. The first professional performer I ever saw was Tito Puente. I have memories of seeing, and that was the bar. And Tito was very engaging and an incredible performer, obviously an iconic musician, but the way he would move the timbale, the way he would engage his showmanship, right? I was captivated by his engagement with the audience and how the performance was really never where he stood. It was in the space that was created by artist and audience. And so performance and poetry, I mean, when I think of it that way, it makes sense. But when I think of it through the lens of sort of the what I inherited in school, you know, I left with a misconception that Latinos didn't write poetry. That is literally what I thought. And it couldn't have been further from the truth.
Yeah. I love that. That's so deep. And I love the way that you are really linking together identity and culture and experience within understanding poetry as this vehicle, as this mechanism, as this tool. And I really think that that's really important, because I think so oftentimes, especially for the audience member, all of these, you know, entrepreneurs and creatives and folks who are launching into passions and dreams, so many times we are kind of regulated to a specific box or a specific space, and don't think that, you know, we can bring in all of these different pieces of ourselves into our work, as opposed to kind of locking this part away and locking this part away. So I just love how you just took us on the journey of all of the pieces to get you where you are now. And I want to talk a little bit more about that performance space, right? So as you just described it, the space between the artists and the audience, kind of just talking a little bit more about that. Like, what does performance mean to you? You know, I went on Twitter and I saw that you were engaging in conversation around, you know, folks who are like, I'm not an artist, and like, how do I perform my poetry and that kind of thing. And so one wants you to kind of talk a little bit about that too.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I have so many thoughts, but I think that um, performance to me is a way to connect um, with an audience, and I think which is the performance, right? Like, for me, which is not everyone's truth, but for me, because my practice is about um, is honoring the oral traditions and using oral traditions, right? There is an exchange and a give and take. And I just sort of want to roll back to something you said about entrepreneurs and those who are listening. I didn't think that I would ever be a writer full time. And that took time, right? I am a freelancer. I am in some respects an entrepreneur. And I have a lot of conversations with other freelancers who are just getting started and want advice on how to, you know, increase their clientele base and all that. I don't think in those terms, but what I can say is that I am very intentional with understanding what is my lane. I understand what I can speak to. I am aware of the unique set of skills and talents that I think I bring to conversations. And I don't try to reach too much outside of that unless I feel like I'm able to speak to those particular issues. And so I think it's important to learn to say yes, but I think it's also important to learn how to say no, and to really trust in your particular niche. No one is doing what you're doing, or right, like, or providing this particular service or expertise, this point of view, bringing in your experiences, your upbringing, your training, right? And to really trust that, and to be able to identify that really succinctly, I think is something that's important for all freelancers. But to sort of fast forward to your question about performance, there are so many poets who do not consider themselves performers. And again, I really think that's okay. You don't have to be the most comfortable with public speaking. But I think it's interesting. I keep quoting Douglas Kearney, but he's honestly one of my favorite artists, poets who talk about performance and what it is. He said that performance is a choice meant to be perceived. That's Douglas Kearney. Performance is a choice meant to be perceived. So whether you are a poet or not, whether you consider yourself the best public speaker or best motivational speaker or not, we all are making choices when we speak. And we all have the capacity to make choices when we use our voice. And that to me is again something that I think all of us can engage in. And in a practice, all of us probably do engage in with our loved ones, right? With, you know, with our family members. The way you talk to your mom is not the way you may talk to your partner or talk to your friend or talk to your coworker, right? We're making choices meant to be perceived. And so I try to pop this bubble of public speaking and pop this bubble of performance, because it's really not about that, right? And there are some people who are really interested in prose and professional, and that's great. But there are writers who I've watched read a poem, and you could, in a room, and you could hear a pin drop. It wasn't that they were the loudest poet. It wasn't that they were the loudest speaker. It wasn't that they had a whole lot of bass in their voice. It was that they were making choices, right? And those choices were intentional and they were authentic. And the people in the room could feel you. And Felicia, as you know, when we talk about spoken word and talk working with young people, it's do I feel you, you know? And so I think it's about bringing that energy and authenticity, if nothing else, to your presentations, into rooms, into your meetings, and into the spaces. Because I tell this to young people who want to start writing poetry and like, well, what do I write about? And I said, start writing about what you care about. Because if you've been in a room with a young person or anybody who is jazzed about an idea, 9 times out of 10, they'll be able to get other people jazzed about this idea. And so it's a deep listening to the things that make your blood move, the passions that you have, and trusting your intuition, trusting the ideas that are your own. And that's hard to do, right? When so much of social media and so much of the noise outside is about questioning your instincts or questioning your ideas. I think performance, I think poetry is about deeply listening.
Yeah. Yeah. I really appreciate that. That's really, I think, just so profound and powerful in that, it is that tuning into that authentic piece, that authentic version of yourself, right? And so you were earlier when you were first talking and introducing kind of the poems that you were going to do, it's that idea of bringing not only the pieces of ourselves, but the pieces of our identity that are marginalized and kind of put off to the side, and bringing those to the center, being able to sit in that authenticity and really amplify that when you're thinking about poetry, when you're thinking about whether it's pursuing your passions, whether it's pursuing the things that you care about. It's like really tuning in to the various pieces of yourselves and bringing them together. And I just want to go back to some of the poems that you were talking about. So like Puertopia and the poem about your water, your water ice or icy snow cones, however, water ice,
water ice, right? Yeah, of course. I love it.
And so, thinking about those pieces, I want to talk a little bit more about the importance of identity and culture for you, right? So in so many of your pieces, you are bringing those threads or those themes there, right? You're talking about your mom and her own culture. You're talking about what it means to grow up in New York City, but also have to navigate your gender, or how folks are perceiving what you should and should not do in terms of sports and that kind of thing. Can you talk to us a little bit about that, and how not only did you navigate identity and culture, but ways that serves as a foundation to your work now?
Yeah, I mean, my artistic practice centers cultural preservation and the power of storytelling to create new narratives. And I had said it earlier, but that poetry allows for this multiplicity. It's a form meant to hold more than one thing at one time, and like that resonates with my story as someone who didn't always feel Latina enough, or Puerto Rican enough, or woman enough, or queer enough, right? But as I said, in poetry, I didn't have to be legible to be discoverable. I didn't have to make sense to make meaning. And I think that those things were really, powerful things that drew me to this art form. And I think a thread, of most of my life, and for I think a lot of us, is just not feeling like you belong. Like, I don't fit neatly into a whole lot of categories. And I think that created a lot of stress, less internal discomfort, but more navigating everyone else's questions and projections. And I think poetry is a powerful way, or has been a powerful way to me to speak back to that. At a young age, I really needed to get on stage. I mean, Felicia, you know this from both your own artistry and probably reflecting on when you started writing poetry, and then the community that you work with. I mean, there's something very powerful about getting on stage and sharing your truth and being held in that, especially if you don't feel held in your family of origin, or you don't feel held in society, or you don't feel seen. And I think a lot of what I needed as a young person, I mean, the first time I ever came out publicly was in a poem. Literally, I had been lying in my poems. I had been writing love poems and using he pronouns. And I got up on stage one day, and I didn't plan it, but I looked down at my notebook and I was like, I poetry is asking me to show up as myself, and is telling me, and this room of poets and community members and friends are saying, we got you. And I think that that community, and that space is really what held me. And so it gave me strength that I didn't have at the time. And who knows when I would have came out if it wasn't for poetry and feeling like I had to show up in both. If I'm going to show up on stage in a more authentic way, then I have to start taking baby steps to do that in real life. And so it fed, the personal is political. And, for me, stepping into my Puerto Rican identity, especially growing up in a mixed household, my father is a white Jewish saxophone player, like met my mom at the Tito Puente concert in the club. Like I have it's a very interesting story. Like, my mom was living in PR, she like the story could have gone a lot of ways. And so that is all of what makes me unique. And that's all poems. It's all songs. It's all music. And it is what gives me an interesting perspective, I think. And it's something that I try to lean into instead of shy away from, right? The discomfort of not feeling like I belonged, for so long, for feeling othered and feeling like I should live in the world with my head down, right? I'm not, around my gender expression and queerness. And, it was really the community spaces that I was able to be a part of in the artistic spaces, and just being able to slowly but surely step into my truth and be unapologetic with that. It was a practice, and it still is. But I think it's important to bring all of you. And I also know it's not easy. And I also know it takes time, because it is not an individual problem. It is a systemic problem. Systemic racism and white supremacy hand us all these narratives around who is acceptable and who is centered, and that everyone else that is not white, straight, Christian, heterosexual, able-bodied, wealthy, I mean, on and on and on, should water themselves down and water their culture down. And I know that feeling. And I know that we negotiate and code switch in our spaces all the time. And I have been all I can say is I think poetry has invited me to reflect on how I show up, and my words and my language. Again, building an intentional relationship with language. How am I describing myself when I speak? How am I always translating for people, right? Like, am I always translating my experience? When am I doing that? I mean, those are the gifts that poetry gives me, are these questions and opportunities to practice reflecting and saying, in that next meeting or in that next interaction or in that next poem, I'm going to write about this experience differently, right? And every poem, I think, like every job, every experience, whether good, bad, I think it brings you to the next thing. Everything brings you to that next moment, that next thing. And so I think for me, it is all about language, and which is about memory and history and culture and identity, and creating a space where all of those things get to live. Because the last thing I'll say is, sometimes the conflict is not our own. Sometimes the conflict is not our own. Sometimes what we think is an internal conflict is actually us negotiating other people's stuff. And so we get to decide how we're going to stand up in our power, how are we going to present ourselves, and to stay the course, and that we don't have to apologize for who we are. And I think these are the things that make workplaces thrive. I think they're the thing that make ideas thrive. And to me, they're sacred and holy. And I think they're things to be uplifted. So
there's so much to unpack. I'm like, I wish you had so much more time.
I know, Felicia, I can see
you had so much more time. My brain is going. I'm just like, oh my goodness, there are so many threads, because, especially as you were talking about, poetry making us ask questions. I have so many times in my own kind of poetry and performance, right? I've gone through. So even as you were talking about, I'm not a performer, folks that feel like that. I've definitely been there. I'm like, I write, but I'm not really a performer. I don't really do that. But even the content. Right.
And what's it about, right? I love science. I'm not a scientist. I
Right.
I sell these things, or I offer these services, but I'm not an entrepreneur, right? What's that space?
And it's so interesting to navigate that space, right? It's so interesting to come into what is that thing that's blocking me? What's in that kind of space? Why don't I feel good enough? Or why don't I feel like a poet enough, or a writer enough, or an entrepreneur enough to be able to call myself a thing, right? Because there is power in naming something. And so what does it mean for me to name, oh, I am this thing, and then be able to show up in that, right? And to show up and ask the questions of, what does it mean? What kind of standard have I been comparing myself to say that I can't be in this space? But then, also thinking about things that you're saying around, the poetry asking you questions. There have been so many times I'm like, Felicia, you should write about something more positive, right? Or you should write more happy poems, or not everyone wants to hear about, racial inequity all the time. Can you talk about the progress or whatever? And I think that there are those times where it's saying, no, 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 no. Like, this is the authentic thing. This is the truth, right? And this is how I'm navigating that space. Like, yes, there are folks who are shouting from the rooftops about progress, but I want to remind us, hey, we still have work to do. I want to say, like, hey, actually, there are so many moments where I am feeling stuck, or I'm feeling discouraged. And that's what I'm using this vehicle to do, because I still want to call people into the work and call people and hold them accountable. So, I mean, so many things, so many threads, so many themes.
And
And so
what
I
a
know, yeah,
powerful way, right, to start like what you just shared. What a powerful way to like invite people into the room, right? Into a hard conversation, is to say, I feel hesitant to share this because, like, that vulnerability is, to
yeah,
me, I'm connecting so deeply with what you're saying. I'm like, oh my God, I'm
yeah.
here. I'm ready to do the work.
Yes, yes, yes. It's so powerful. I know we're getting close to time. We're wrapping up. And so I just want to kind of offer a final question. So for all of the audience members, folks are loving you, as they should, in the chat, and expressing their deepest appreciation for all that you're saying and offering to us. Just thinking about walking away. We're coming off of this session. We're going into our day to day, our regular kinds of activity and tasks. And what do you think we should be bringing with us? What are kind of the takeaways, or the question, or the kind of thought that you want us to continue to consider as we're going forward?
I think that I want to invite us all into this project of being curious. I think I try to live my life being curious, um, which because I don't think shame is motivating, and I don't think guilt is motivating. But if I can live a life of curiosity, to be curious about other people's experiences, um, to then I feel like I'm ready to listen for the work that I need to do. And so I'm curious about, if I'm curious about the language I'm using, if I'm curious about the language other people are using, if I'm curious about other you know communities. And by communities, I really just want to say beloveds, friends, histories and contributions and cultures. I feel like that's the life that I want to live, and that's the life that's actually going to bring us into a better space. To me, that is what will allow this quote unquote word progress, which to me, I want my progress to be liberatory. I want a liberation for every, marginalized and underserved community. And so, how do I use my privileges in rooms to crack those doors open? How can I use my disadvantages, so to speak, or what are perceived as disadvantages, as a unique window into building community and bringing other people along? I mean, I'm always sort of trying to enter the spaces with a sense of curiosity. And I think that is, again, about building an intentional relationship with language. And I think that this is important for all of us to do. We are to re-engage with each other on different terms, to re-establish or to rethink our relationship with language, is to rethink our relationship with each other. And I think that's the project of social justice. I think that is the project of like being a good person, and more than good, being a thoughtful person, and building with folks. It makes, to me, everything else possible. Work, family, life. It makes everything else possible. Trying to come to these conversations, not in a defensive stance, but living my life with a sense of curiosity, and trying to build an intentional relationship with language.
Yeah, so helpful and so powerful. So we are going to walk away from this session really being able to ask ourselves and be curious, be open, and remain curious to be able to engage differently with the folks around us. Denice, in so many ways, I just want to thank you for being here, for giving us so much to think on and chew on and take away. I know for me, I'm just so inspired and definitely so grateful to have spent this time with you. So thank you so much again for being here and showing up in so many different ways. Everyone that is in the audience, I want to thank you as well for taking the time and being here. We thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you for filling the comments with all emojis and questions. And definitely follow Denice all over social media, visit her website, support her work, and continue to support the work of folks around you. So thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Denice.
Thank you, Felicia. Next time, it's a double feature for us.
Yes, we have to. We must.
Yes. Next time, we're behind the walls. All right. Thank you so much, everyone.
Everybody. Thank you.